Hi, this is Kate, Teen Services Librarian at the Brighton District Library, and today we are going to make this little guy. So if you got one of our kits, it should have come with some paints and a brush, some Sharpie markers, both thick and thin, an extra sets of brushes, some watercolor paper, um, some graphite transfer paper that we have here, one big sheet, you can cut it down, and some templates. We are going to be using this little guy here, but you can use one of the other ones if you want, just using the same technique. You're also going to want to make sure that you have some cups of cold water and paper towel at the ready for cleaning your brushes. If you happen to have some painter's tape, that might be useful later, but it's not required. All right, so before I started this, I already prepped my paper. So in your watercolor paper, you're actually just going to take your template, this, and your graphite tracing paper, and you're going to want to put the darker side of the tracing paper down over top of your paper, and then you're going to put your template and you're just going to trace over it. I like to use a different colored pencil because that way I can see which lines I've already done while tracing, and it will come out looking something like this. Now grab your Sharpie markers. I'm mostly going to be using the Alt Extra Fine Tip one, and I'm just going to go over all the lines, and I'm going to use my little template as a reference for what to color in. Next, I am going to grab my regular fine tip Sharpie marker, so the slightly bigger one, and I'm going to start coloring in those dark shadows. And also, you don't have to do this part, it's just a stylistic choice that I made, where I like to do a heavier outline around all of the edges um, of, of the drawing, and not going into any of the details. I just like the kind of Art Nouveau-esque style it gives to it. So I'm just going to do that. Like I said, you don't have to. You can kind of choose whichever you want to do, but I like how it looks. Now, once you put down all your Sharpie, you're going to want to let your drawing sit for a few minutes, just to make sure that Sharpie is nice and dry before you move on to the painting process. If you start putting down paint right away, the Sharpie could bleed because it's not fully dry. So you're just going to let it sit for a minute or two, and then we'll come back to it and start painting. All right, to start with, I'm going to be using the brush that was actually in the kit, and I'm going to load it up with water. And then I'm mostly going to be I'm going to take some of this green on my palette, and I'm actually going to move it over to the side onto this clear plastic part. And I'm going to add some water in there to make sure it's nice and watery and not too thick. We're going to want it to have a transparent quality to it. I'm also going to grab some blue, and you can grab whichever colors for this part that you want. Probably stick to blue, yellows, and greens. You could probably do the other colors too, but this is just because we're doing a green creature, it works best. And then I'm just going to start laying down color over the whole drawing. And it should, as long as your Sharpie's dry, it should go right over. And you want to make sure that you have a good amount of water in your brush, so that it flows well. And you can always switch up a little bit of your colors. You can see I went and grabbed some blue and just threw it on because it was too monotone for me. And then something you can also do is, if you have a watery Russian color, you can go ahead and tilt your paper and let just gravity take control, and it's going to give you this kind of neat drip effect that you can do. So I'm just going to do that. You could also do some splatter, however you want. This is just to kind of This is just a style choice at this point. So I'm going to keep doing that, let it tip a little bit, shake it, and then if you get any underneath, go ahead and wipe it up before you put your paper down. And that's all I want to do for this part. And then I'm going to have to let it dry. Now, you're going to want to let your painting sit for a few minutes so that it dries properly. You can tap it to see if it's still wet or not at this point, but make sure it's fully dry before you do this next part. So I'm going to grab some water and grab some of my brown colored paint. And I'm going to make sure I've got a decent amount of water in there. And then I'm actually going to grab just a tiny bit of the black, not tons, but just a little bit, and add it in. So this is to make it a little more of a muddy brown color, and then I can test out my colors on that template just to kind of get an idea of what it's going to be. And then once I do, I'm just going to go in and start painting onto his clothing here. And with watercolors, while it's wet, you kind of want to just like do a continuous line. So I'm gonna just continue on from the watercolor, and if I need more paint, I'll go get it, and then I'll just start where that line where I left off, just to give it this continuous wash. And I can do this in kind of segments here because because of those black lines, they're not connected to the other portions. But wherever I don't have a black line, that's where I'm going to be a little more careful with those washes and making sure that I'm connecting them. And go into his arm here. There. Touch up, and then I'm going to go in for the larger portion right underneath that cup. Again, those little folds. And I'm not going to worry too much if there's some color disparity in his clothing because it's pretty rough and beaten up anyway. So if there's some discrepancies in colors or it looks like you get some weird things going on with the watercolor, it just looks like it's meant to be there. It's not going to be a huge deal, so don't worry too much. If you run out of paint and you got to mix some more and then there seems to be a different color, you can just pretend it's a fold and that you did it intentionally. So you can see here, I ran out of some colors, so I gotta go grab some more brown and a little bit black. And you can see it's slightly different color than what I had before, like similar and on the right track, but it's not exact. So I'm just gonna try and blend it as best as I can here. And the thing to remember about watercolors is they are transparent. So you're going to see things through them. They don't work like acrylic paints do, where you can just cover up huge mistakes. You just got to kind of figure out how to work with whatever mistake you make and try and make it look intentional. So here I'm just like, we'll just go in and I'm going to make the whole thing kind of spotty with color so that it looks like I meant to do it. I'm going to clean off my brush and I'm going to let this dry. I'm not going to want to touch the next part until that's dry. So once you've let the brown part dry, I'm going to grab some water and grab some green and put it on the side of my palette, and then I'm going to grab some yellow. Don't be like me. Make sure your brush is really clean before you go into that yellow so you don't completely contaminate it. And then I'm going to test out my green there. There. It's still a little too neon for me, so I'm going to take a bit of that brown that I was using earlier and actually just dab it into the green. This is going to give me a more of a moss-like green, so I like that a little better. Then I'm going to clean off my brush, and I'm going to get that mossy green, and I'm just going to start going in on this little guy's face. And I'm going to leave, it's hard to tell here because of the camera backed up, but I'm going to leave a tiny little bit of dot on the nose of the color underneath, so just a little bit to give a highlight. You don't have to, but I like doing that for some depth. And then I'm just going to go over his entire head here with this green. And it's not going to make a big difference yet, but just get that color down. You can start seeing him pop a little more. And then of course going to go and do his hands with that same color green. And I switched to one of the smaller brushes that were in the kit so that I can get into those tiny details and not go over the cup, because you want to leave the cup without that color. And I'm just going to do some touch up. And then once I get that in, I'm going to go in and grab my brown and put a black into it. And while I'm waiting for my green to dry, I'm going to go in and try and put in some shadows on the clothing. So for the shadows, I tend to put a little bit of a darker brown just anywhere there's a fold. So where if the clothing is folded or if there's an arm going up in it, it's going to cast somewhat of a shadow. So I'm just going to take my brush and just put a little bit of that darker color brown in the folds and underneath his arms, things like that. Yep, so just taking that and just kind of choosing places where I want to go. So at the bottom of his foot, we've got this fold, so I'm just going to do a little bit of a line of that dark brown underneath. Another one there. Right under his arm, so in his sleeves where we have all those folds, going under there is a good idea. Along this little line, I'm going to put in a random line that's a fold here. So just think about clothing and where something would fold on the body, and that's going to be where you're going to put in those shadows and darker lines. There, and you can only do this if you feel comfortable. If you don't, you can just kind of follow all of those lines from the template that we put in. Like I said, for this darker color, it's really just going to be judgment. You're going to put in your brown, and then you can just add the black and add some water into it and see how dark you want to get it. You just need it slightly darker than what you did before. They have it layer. I'm going to put in some random little fold lines up in the arms here. And some of them aren't going to follow those black marker lines that I put in. So this is going to be something you'll learn with practice as you do it. But right now, one of the nice things with this template and having all these lines in, you don't have to do this part and it's still going to look pretty good. But it just adds a little bit of depth if you want to practice to it, going and putting some shadows in there. That's about all I'm going to do on this little guy until we get to the next part. But we're going to let that dry for a minute before we go into the greens again. Okay, next I'm going to paint the cup. So I'm going to take just some of that black and I'm going to put quite a bit of water into it to make sure it's more of a gray color. And so test that out. And then I'm going to start painting in the cup. And I'm going to leave a small little rectangle of it as just like the color of the paper underneath. And that's just going to be a little highlight. And then I'm going to get some darker paint. So I'm going to make it black, so less water in it, and I'm going to color the inside of that cup to make it hollowed out. And then maybe a little bit of shadow at the bottom of the cup underneath. And that's all there is to that. Okay, the next part is going to be a little tricky, so I'm going to grab some red and I make sure there's lots of water so it's pink, and then I'm going to go in underneath his ears because they're not pure gray. There's a little bit of pink in them. And then I'm going to take a little bit of my green color with that's highly saturated, and I'm just going to run that along that little pinkish line that I put in and over it so that it kind of lessens it and it looks more gradual. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. This is another one of those parts where if you don't feel comfortable doing this, you can just be like, nope, and just shade it, put a shading line with a darker green if you want. But if you're up for a challenge, grab some of that pink. All right, this guy isn't green enough for my taste, so I'm going to take some of that green and brown, and I'm going to go back in on his face. And when I'm doing this, I'm going to be a little more intentional with where I'm going to leave the paper to shine through. So I'm going to leave a little round dot on the nose that isn't going to be colored in with this darker green. And then I'm just going to start spreading out that darker green very carefully. As you can see, I'm using the really thin brush. And I'm going to go around the eyes, and then the face and the nose. Originally, when I did this, I was thinking like, oh, I'm just going to put some shadows in, but then I said, nope, he was too light of a green for me overall, so I just started going in with this wash again. And you can see he's starting to look more like the color he's supposed to be. So I'm just going to keep going in with that darker green, layer over it, try and get into the details. Then I got to do the hands here. Just a little bit more. Almost done with this little guy. And voila, he is all done. Now, I hope you enjoyed this, and you can use this technique in multiple ways, just using watercolors and Sharpie, and make sure you're using your watercolor paper, and share with the library what you end up doing. We'd love to see it. You can tag us on Instagram or go and send us to our Facebook. Tag us on Facebook, whichever you so prefer, and we'll see you next time.